My name is Elena Voss, and I need to tell you how my mother saved me from beyond the grave, and how the man I loved for 13 years showed me exactly who he was on the worst day of my life. It started 3 days after we buried my mother. 3 days. I was still finding her handwriting on sticky notes around my kitchen, still reaching for my phone to call her before remembering I couldn't, still completely shattered in every way a person can be shattered. And that's when my husband Julian decided it was time to talk. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. My mother, Elena Voss, was the kind of woman people write songs about. She immigrated to this country with almost nothing, built a life through sheer stubbornness and intelligence, and raised me alone after my father passed away when I was 9. She was a hospital administrator for over 30 years, disciplined, precise. She invested quietly, lived modestly, and never once made me feel like we were lacking anything. She was also the most perceptive woman I have ever known. When I met Julian at 24, I was convinced he was everything. He was charming, ambitious, always working an angle toward the next big thing. He talked about the future in this sweeping, cinematic way that made you want to believe every word. My mother met him 3 times before our wedding. She never said anything directly against him, but I noticed the way she watched him. Quiet, measuring, like she was doing long division in her head and not liking the answer. I told myself she was just protective, that she'd warm up to him eventually. She never did. 18 months before she passed, my mother was diagnosed with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer. It moved fast and showed no mercy. 1 week, she was attending her neighborhood book club and tending her garden. 6 weeks later, she was in a hospital bed, making arrangements. I took a leave of absence from work immediately. I moved into her apartment 3 days a week and reorganized my entire life around being present with her. Julian resented it from the start. He said I was abandoning our marriage, said I was emotionally unavailable, said the commute to her place was disrupting his routine. His routine. My mother was dying, and he was worried about his routine. I stopped arguing about it with him and just showed up for her anyway. Those months, as painful as they were some of the most meaningful of my life. We talked about everything, her childhood, my father, her regrets, and her proudest moments. She told me things she'd never told anyone. And about 6 weeks before she passed, she held my hand very tightly and said something I didn't fully understand at the time. "Promise me you'll trust Thomas Sterling. He's my attorney, and he's been handling my affairs for 15 years. When the time comes, and I need you to hear me when I say when, not if, you call Thomas first. Before you do anything else, before you sign anything, you call Thomas." "Mama, you're scaring me," I said. She just looked at me with those calm, knowing eyes. Some people don't reveal themselves until there's something at stake. Just remember that, and remember Thomas Sterling. She passed on a Thursday morning in November. I was holding her hand. Julian was at a property showing. The funeral was held in the community center of her neighborhood, the same building where she'd organized food drives and mentored young professionals for 2 decades. The people who came weren't just family. They were neighbors, former colleagues, the woman she'd helped find housing during a difficult season, the young man whose college application she'd reviewed 3 years in a row until he got accepted. My mother had built something in that community, and it showed. Julian sat beside me at the service, squeezing my hand at the right moments, playing the part. I remember thinking at one point, "This is good, we're going to be okay," and feeling grateful. I was wrong. The first sign came that same evening. We were barely home from the reception when Julian started asking about the paperwork. Had I talked to her estate attorney? Did I know what she'd left? What was the approximate value? "Julian, she was buried today." "I know, I'm just thinking ahead. We need to know what we're dealing with." I told him I didn't know the details and didn't want to think about it tonight. He dropped it, but I noticed he didn't apologize. 3 days later, he came into the living room where I was sitting surrounded by sympathy cards, still wearing the same oversized sweater I'd had on for 2 days, and he sat across from me with a look on his face I had never seen before. Calculated, decided, almost relieved. "Elena, I think we should separate." I stared at him for a long time. "My mother died 3 days ago." "I know, and I'm sorry about that, but I've been feeling this way for a long time. I don't think we're right for each other. I think the kindest thing is to be honest now." I asked him to leave the apartment. He did, but not before saying something that dropped like a stone into still water. "You should look into getting your own lawyer. Community property laws are pretty clear about inheritance that comes in during a marriage. Just keep that in mind." He left, and I sat on the floor and cried until I had nothing left. The next morning, my best friend Diane came over. She'd been checking on me every day since my mother passed. When she saw my face, she knew something beyond grief had happened. I told her everything. She held me while I cried, and then she said, "Elena, call Thomas Sterling." I'd almost forgotten. My mother's last instructions: call Thomas first, before you sign anything. I found his number in my mother's address book and called his office the next morning. His assistant told me he'd been expecting my call and could see me that afternoon. That sent a chill through me. How had he known to expect me? Thomas Sterling's office was in a quiet, professional building downtown, clean, understated, the kind of place that signals competence without needing to show off. He was in his early 70s, silver-haired, with glasses, and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen everything and remained unsurprised by all of it. He stood when I walked in and shook my hand with both of his. "Elena, I'm so sorry about Evelyn. She was a remarkable woman and a very dear client." We sat down. He had several folders organized on his desk. "Your mother came to see me 14 months ago," he began. "At the time, she hadn't received any diagnosis yet, but she told me she wanted to restructure her estate. She said she had a feeling, her exact words, and she wanted to make sure everything was properly protected." My stomach tightened. Protected from what? He looked at me carefully. "She asked me to set up an irrevocable inheritance protection trust for every asset she intended to leave you. The house, which she owned free and clear, valued at approximately $610,000, her savings and investment accounts totaling around $890,000, her life insurance policy at $400,000, all of it placed in trust, all of it designated as your separate protected property." I did the math slowly. That's almost $2 million. $1.9 million, to be precise. I couldn't speak for a moment. "Under the terms your mother specified, these assets are yours and yours alone. They cannot be considered community property. They cannot be subject to division in a divorce proceeding. The trust is irrevocable. It cannot be challenged, altered, or overturned. Your mother made sure of that." She knew. She knew Julian would do this. Thomas Sterling didn't look surprised. She never said his name directly to me, but she asked very specific questions about protecting inheritance from spousal claims. She was thorough. She thought through every scenario. He slid an envelope across the desk. My name was written on it in my mother's handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. "My darling Elena, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I suspect Julian has already shown you who he really is. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. There is no gentle version of this lesson. I started noticing the change in him years ago, the way he talked about money, not as a tool, but as a measure of worth. The way he looked at my home like it was an asset on a balance sheet. The way he sometimes looked at you like he was calculating what you were worth to him. I hoped I was wrong. I prayed I was wrong, but I loved you too much to leave your future unprotected on the chance that I was right. Everything I've left you is yours. I want it to give you freedom. Freedom to leave what isn't working. Freedom to start something new. Freedom to build a life entirely on your own terms. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting yourself. You are not too much. You are not too little. You are exactly enough, and you always have been. Stand tall, my love. I am with you in every decision you make. All my love, always. Mama. I cried in Thomas Sterling's office for a long time. He handed me tissues and waited. When I finally composed myself, he told me one more thing. Your mother left instructions that if Julian filed for divorce within 1 year of her passing, I was to contact you immediately and guide you through the proceedings. She even set aside funds specifically for your legal fees. He paused. She thought of everything, Elena. What do I do now? Now, he said, with the calm confidence of someone who had won this kind of fight before, we let your husband believe he is winning. We let him get comfortable, and when the moment is right, we show him exactly what your mother did. I drove home with my mother's letter folded against my chest. Julian had come back while I was out. He was in the kitchen, relaxed, acting like nothing had happened. Did you talk to anyone about the estate? He asked, almost casually. I met with my mother's attorney. It's more than I thought, significantly more. I watched his face, the way his eyes sharpened, the way he sat up slightly straighter. How much more? Close to 2 million. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. He softened, he moved closer, he started calling me babe again. That's incredible. Your mother really built something. He took my hand. Listen, I know things have been rough between us. Maybe we should slow down on the divorce talk, figure this out together. I looked at him and felt something cold and clear settle in my chest. I said, "You're right, let's figure it out." The test my mother had anticipated came about 2 weeks later. Julian came to me with an opportunity. A friend of his was selling a beach house, a stunning property, he said, a steal at the price. He wanted to put in an offer immediately before someone else grabbed it. He just needed me to front $120,000 as a down payment. We were still technically married, so it was practically community funds anyway, right? We'd sort out the details when the divorce was finalized. It was a smart investment. He was doing me a favor. That was the moment I knew my mother had predicted everything down to the sentence. I told him I needed to think about it. Then I drove to Thomas Sterling's office and told him Julian had asked. Sterling smiled for the first time. Then we're ready. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. Julian arrived with his attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Calloway, who specialized in high-asset divorces. They were confident, almost jovial, when they sat across from me and Thomas Sterling in the conference room. Calloway led. We'd like to establish upfront that the inheritance in question, received during the marriage, constitutes community property under applicable law. My client is entitled to a 50% share of all marital assets, including the estate of Mrs. Elena Voss. I appreciate your position, Thomas Sterling said, pleasant and unmoved. However, there are some things about Mrs. Voss's estate your client appears not to know. He opened his folder. Slowly, deliberately. 14 months before her passing, Mrs. Voss established an irrevocable inheritance protection trust. Every asset she intended to leave her daughter was placed in that trust, with explicit terms designating it as Elena's sole and separate property. No spousal claims, no exceptions. Trusts can still be contested, Calloway said carefully. You're welcome to try, Sterling replied. I've been doing this for 37 years. I've had 3 cases involving this specific trust structure challenged in court. I won all 3. I'd encourage you to do the math on your hourly rate before advising your client to proceed. The silence in that room was extraordinary, and then Julian broke it. She can't do this, he said, his voice rising. We're married. Half of everything is mine. That's the law. Half of the marital assets is yours, the jointly owned vehicle, the shared savings. But this inheritance, it was never a marital asset, not legally, not in any court that will hear this. Julian turned to me. You knew, this whole time you knew. I looked at him steadily. My mother knew. She saw you long before I did. He stood up so fast his chair scraped back. His attorney caught his arm. We're contesting this. That is your right, Sterling said. My client will see you in court. They left, and I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since November. Julian did not take it gracefully. Within days, he was posting on social media long, wounded screeds about being cut out of an inheritance that was legally his, painting me as controlling and manipulative, claiming I had isolated him during our marriage. He tagged mutual friends. He sent messages to my professional contacts. It was humiliating and it was a lie, and for about a week, I watched people I thought I knew begin to question me. Thomas Sterling's advice? Don't respond. Document everything. This is exactly the kind of character evidence that matters in court. I didn't respond, but it hurt. What happened next hurt in a different way. I came home one evening to find my front door ajar. I stayed outside and called the police. When they arrived and cleared the house, they walked me through what Julian had done. My mother's vintage upright piano, the one she'd played since she was a girl, the one she'd had shipped across 3 states to keep when she moved, the one I had been planning to restore, was destroyed. The lid was smashed, the keys were scattered. Written on the wall in black marker above where it stood, "You'll never be rid of me." He'd also gone through every drawer, overturned shelves, and left the place in ruins. The police found him at a friend's place 2 days later. He was arrested and charged with breaking and entering, destruction of property, and criminal threatening. The criminal case moved separately from the divorce. What I did not expect was what happened the morning after the break-in. My neighbors came. Not 1 or 2, dozens. People from my building, from the block, colleagues my mother had mentored, a woman from her book club who I'd only met once. They showed up with cleaning supplies and coffee, and a very calm, collective decision that I would not face this alone. They helped me sweep the debris from the piano. They patched the wall. They sat with me when I needed to cry, and gave me space when I needed silence. One woman, Mrs. Adeyemi, who had known my mother for 20 years, held my face in both hands and said, "Your mother poured into this community her whole life. Now we pour back into you. That's how it works." I understood then what my mother had actually been building all those years. Not just wealth, not just security, this network of people who would show up. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. Julian, facing legal bills he couldn't sustain and a criminal record he hadn't anticipated, agreed to all terms. We split the joint assets, our shared savings, our car, the proceeds from surrendering our apartment lease. Clean and simple. The $1.9 million inheritance remained entirely mine, every cent exactly as my mother intended. Julian pleaded guilty to the vandalism and breaking and entering charges, probation, restitution, and a permanent restraining order. The social media posts? By the time the truth came out, most of the people who'd questioned me sent quiet apologies. Some I accepted, others I noted and moved on. In the months that followed, I built something new. I restored what I could of the piano, not to its original state, but to something that played again. It sits in my apartment now, a little imperfect, a little scarred, and still beautiful. I enrolled in a graduate program in urban design that I'd deferred for years, telling myself the timing was never right. I traveled, first to Portugal, where my mother had always wanted to go, and where I sat at a cafe in Lisbon and ordered her favorite kind of pastry and cried in the most peaceful way I've ever cried. Then to Japan, where I spent 2 weeks walking through gardens and feeling for the first time in years genuinely quiet inside. And I established a scholarship in my mother's name, awarded annually to a first-generation college student from our neighborhood, the kind of student my mother had been once, the kind of student she'd spent her whole career quietly championing. At the first ceremony, I stood in front of the community and said the only thing I knew to be true. My mother taught me that real love plans ahead. It doesn't just hope for the best, it prepares for what might go wrong, and it does that work quietly, without asking for credit. If someone in your life loves you like that, the way my mother loved me, please don't take it for granted. That kind of love is rare, and it lasts longer than a lifetime. It's been 2 years now. I'm not looking for what comes next romantically. I'm not avoiding it either. I'm just present, comfortable in my own life in a way I haven't been since before I knew what I was missing. Julian tried to reach me once through a mutual contact, claiming he wanted to apologize. I didn't respond. I genuinely wish him nothing. Not harm, not failure, just nothing. He doesn't take up space in my head anymore. On the second anniversary of my mother's passing, I sat in the garden where her ashes were scattered and read her a letter I'd written. I told her about the scholarship, about Lisbon, about the piano. I told her she had been right about everything. And then I told her the most important thing. I'm not just surviving, I'm living, really living, just like you told me to. The wind moved through the garden, and I stayed until it was almost dark. My mother spent her whole life building something for me, not just money, but wisdom, not just security, but freedom. And when she knew she was running out of time, she used every tool she had to make sure that what she'd built would actually reach me, that no one could intercept it, that I would be protected even after she was gone. Julian thought he saw an inheritance. He never understood what he was actually looking at. He was looking at a mother's love, patient, strategic, and longer lasting than either of us. And that love won. If this story moved you, I'd love to know. Drop a comment and tell me about someone who protected you in ways you didn't fully understand until later. And if you haven't already, subscribe. There are more stories coming, and I read every single one of your comments.